Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the organizers to invite me here today. My background is, as said, in development studies. I've been teaching development studies since 2002, and I have not been doing that much research on migration, but I've been teaching lots about it, and I was forced to go through lots of the research that has been done on the topic. So when I was invited the first time to a meeting with the people here in Pufendorf to think about this topic, I did not think that it was going to be so intimidating as it is now. It started with this equipment that, as you can see, my mobility is not that relaxed. Of course, it is a great challenge for me to be talking to an audience like you that have been in contact with the issues of migration and the different ways we study migration. So this is a very, very wide and fancy and complicated title, but what I will try to do here today is to share with you, because this is one of the first things that I learned when I was one of the first groups to be here in Pufendorf, that this is a place to be able to think loud, and that's what I'm going to do today. So just take this presentation as a process of brainstorming a little bit loud. And what I thought of talking about and sharing with you a little bit today was this topic. Don't take this as an outline, because it's not really an outline, but some of the issues that I'll be touching upon, and I will try to exemplify a little bit what I mean with these different things. I know it is very, very provocative to ask a question like, what is the subject matter about, when we're in a place where people had been studying migration for such a long time, and we have so many theories going to the left and to the right, dealing with the issue of human movements and so on and so forth. But I think it's really, really acute, as far as I'm concerned, to go a little bit and ask this question again, because the discipline is so developed today that what we might call migration might mean for many researchers so many different things. So I think it's time for us to be able to reflect again upon the discipline itself, and or the disciplines, I would like to say. The second thing that I find very urgent too is to think a little bit about the sensitivity of this field towards that thing that we call ideology. And please take the concept of ideology in a very generic sense. Think about ideology, just that thing that researchers, social scientists, and even politicians use when they reach that point where they cannot prove things, where my studies cannot give me, or my experiment cannot give me any more real detailed arguments to convince you. Then I start with that part. But I believe that the best thing is this, and I believe that the best thing is that. I believe that what we should do in the future is this, based on this and that belief. So take ideology in that sense. Of course, all science, and above all social sciences, are very, very sensitive to ideology in all imaginable ways, from the context, the historical context we're talking about, to the proceedings and the mechanisms to fund the research. Of course, if you are, as a researcher, in line with what these structures are interested in, you're more likely to be able to do that research. The less you are in line with what is being asked for, if you could say so, demanded for, the lower the chances that you will be able to do that research. Of course, unless you are going to do it free and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I will be a little bit touching upon the issue of ideology and its meaning for the field. And the last thing, a very broad thing that I will try to do is to reflect upon three concepts that are extremely crucial, a sine qua non for the understanding of migration and the definition of the concept itself. And that is space, of course, time, and scale. And again, here, scale, I know that there are experts on scale here. So I'm thinking here about scale beyond only the geographical scale, but scale at the level of the intellectual activities that happen during the research process. So, having said that, I will try to look a little bit on the narratives that we think about, and they come into being when we think about human mobility or human movement, let's put it this way, for thousands of years ago. And you will see that most of the disciplines and the sciences that are interested in this kind of movement, they will be mostly interested in genetic aspects, in archaeological aspects, in historical aspects. And you will see that this is not very politically loaded, in the sense that the terminology that we see here, it's almost about species, different kinds of our humanoids that moved through the... And unless you go to some extreme narratives, you will never see this politicized. Of course, you can find people that they even use this in the ideological sense to say that we are the spot where humans started and so on and so forth. I've seen very, very interesting political discourse on South-South collaboration, where a collaboration between Brazil and Africa was using the picture of the Pangea, when everything was put in the same spot, to say we have a stronger attachment to Africa than other parts of the world. And I found that very, very provocative, of course, interesting, and taking the aspect of narrative to its extreme. But what I'm trying to say here is that this movement is studied in a way where space is very fluid. It's not organized, as we will see later on, in other spaces, in other contexts. And the organization of space is, as I said before, the sine qua non for migration. Think about it. In some places, we can move for thousands of kilometers without being migrants. In other spaces, we move only for 100 meters, and all of a sudden, we are migrants. So the first question would be to ask is, can we ignore, as researchers interested in the issue of migration, this organization of space and its nature, and so on and so forth? The other thing that you could observe is the issue of time. The longer the time, the less sensitive is the issue to ideology. None of us that would be studying today the issues of nationalism and migration, or the right-wing uprising in the Western Europe, let's say, and migration, would be interested in such a long narratives. It would be meaningless for a right-wing activist to start thinking about where are we coming from, all of us. That would not be very much useful for his or her own political agenda. If we say that everybody is coming from the Lake Victoria, then a crucial thing that is important for the discourses of migration will totally disappear. We will never know who belongs where, and so on and so forth. And as we will see, this is a contradicting the way the socio-economic system that we're having today operates. Capitalism is trying, in fact, to convince us that the main role of global capital today is to break down, to reorganize, to make it easy for capital and labor and so on and so forth to move those classical factors. But when we move forward in time, then we will see that this organization of space will start putting a new stamp on the narratives of migration. All of a sudden, the who is who becomes more crucial. And this might look as a very neutral thing, but in fact, it is much related to explaining why these kind of groups are leaving this and that kind of space, why are they coming to a specific kind of space, and so on and so forth, and not only in relation to every single group, but relating those different groups. I can give you a small example that I hear every time that I'm in the southern part of Europe. When I come to Spain, for example, they will ask me, you are interested in the Chinese expansion at the global level and all that, and I will say yes. They say, the Chinese community in Spain is growing, it's becoming more and more and more and more, but, and this is a very big but, they are the community that we have the least problem with. They do not create any kind of problems and so on. Yes, they might create some kind of problems, but they are internal problems. They never require from the Spanish judicial system and so on and so forth to interfere. They never require support from the Spanish authorities and so on and so forth. So these narratives are extremely important, and they will be always located to some kind of a organized space. African migrants, Middle Eastern migrants, Latin American migrants, and so on and so forth. But when you use scale here, you will find lots of interesting things. You believe that there is something in France called African migrants, but when you come to the African migrant themselves, they will give you other kinds of categories based on lower scales. Yes, I'm an African migrant, but I'm from Senegal. Don't confuse me with somebody from Côte d'Ivoire, because they behave in this and that way, and all the stereotypes come into being. So it is extremely interesting how this, even sometimes in the most radical researchers and critical researchers trying to study this, we unfortunately reproduce those languages, those stereotypes, and we use them here and there. We have, of course, the economic way of thinking, the neoliberal way of thinking, those who are still insisting that the development that we're seeing today is a development related to the way we produce and consume the material life. So what we're seeing today is a movement of labor force from one place to the other. Of course, that labor force is categorized and it's organized in a very, very special way where high elite professionals and all that have, of course, more mobility than low-skilled labor force and so on and so forth. But, and this is a very big but, everybody is welcome to some extent. Everybody will have a position. Let's think about low-skilled laborers. They fluctuate. Their demand, for example, in the case of Europe, fluctuate. Sometimes they're welcome. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes we decide exactly what kind of characteristics. I can give you a historical example which is extremely interesting, and I met some of the people that went through this. And this is in the southern part of Morocco during the 1960s, when different companies used to come and go to different villages to look for labor force. And everybody realized that they're always looking for young males in good health, and they will come there with their physicians and all that. So they will do the health checkup and so on and so forth. So they should be healthy. They should be able to work hard and so on and so forth. But they will also be asked, can you read and write? And somebody realized a pattern that was very strange, that every time that you said that you could read and write, you're not welcome. They didn't want to have you. Totally opposite to the discourse that would... So even people would come lying at the very beginning about their ability to read and write without doing it. Or later on, people started that they can read and write, start saying that they could not read and write, which is a much easier way to so they realized that some of these companies that will take this labor force to work in factories and all that was not interested in somebody who could come there, and above all, if they can read French and know a little bit about their rights and possibilities to get into organized labor and so on and so forth. All that was not decided in Morocco. All that was not decided. All that was well studied by these different companies that they were going to engage people from this part of the world. So again here, when you take up ignore the issues of organized space and start looking on the movement of labor and all that, you will see that here the time is very, very short. We're just looking on how many people moved from one place to the other, and of course, no one can read this, no one can look at this without triggering lots of thoughts. Oh, is it a good thing that people from South Africa are coming to North America? Is it? No one can read this in a very neutral way. All of you have some kind of a luggage that will start directly making interpretations of. And when you look at it from this perspective, you see something very interesting happening. And I just want to underline something that you've maybe already realized. What we're talking about here is mostly legal, formal migration, those numbers that we can really be sure about and so on and so forth. So we're seeing here that it is a specific kind of population that can move, and it's a specific kind of people. And you will see that the biggest movements today are concentrated only to 20 countries. And when you look at some of these countries, if you look, I just put here Saudi Arabia because it's in such a high position, you will understand directly that this is not a kind of refugees or a kind of migrants that are heading to a place where they would want to stay the rest of their lives. This can indicate to you that what is still dominating and is very, very strong is the economic migrant that in one way or another is moving from one place to the other. But many times, above all, maybe not in the academic world, it happens there too, but above all in the political discourse, it seems that migration is being more and more referred to as refugees more than any other thing. And here we will see lots of movement happening, but still this is very, very located to specific places. And it's a very, very limited amount of people despite all that move. But this might change if you play with the scale. If you all of a sudden consider people moving from the northern part of Sudan to other spots of Sudan because of security reasons, then all of a sudden you will start thinking about refugees in other way. And this is something that we know of, because every time that we think about migration and we try to reflect upon it, we're implicitly thinking about the impacts of migration. Positive and negative impacts become central in any kind of research on migration. And when you listen to the global discourse and all that, it seems that there is a clear pattern, and that is that wars, conflicts are happening in the southern part of the globe, and those refugees are invading the northern part of the globe. But there is nothing further from the truth than that, because when we look really to people that have been displaced because of war and all that, most of them will stay in poor societies that are closer to them or even poorer than their place. But this discussion does not seem to be the central one. And this will lead me to a final issue when I talk about power relations when it comes to thinking about migration. Another thing that it's becoming really, at least in my field in development studies, very popular to study is the positive impacts of migration on the sending societies. You will see lots of people saying that, oh, this thing of migration is becoming almost an alternative to that thing that we, during the 1960s and the 1970s, we used to call economic development. And we can give big numbers and show how the remittances, for example, are becoming a bigger part of the GDP, and this must be a good thing and all that. This is, again, very important to link to other discourses that might seem not related about the future agenda of migration. There are some liberal voices that they are saying that what the best thing we could do is to organize the global market in the following way. That we in Europe, for example, have some kind of offices in the northern part of Africa, southern part of Africa, and look for that labor force that is suitable for what we need and bring them here in a very organized way, respect their rights and so on and so forth, and in some footnote, when we're done with them, they can go back. So again, this is becoming really, really a very interesting issue. Of course, there are those who look also on the negative side effect. Brain drain would be one of them, how rich England, rich UK is abusing different parts in the southern part of Africa by stealing health personnel, nurses and doctors and so on and so forth, and have them push down the prices of the labor force in England and not needing to pay anything for their education and so on and so forth. So these are becoming issues also that dominate so much that all of a sudden the idea of migration moves towards specific problems that in specific moments and in specific contexts, they become the central topic of research for many countries. If you come to Spain, Italy, and all that, you will see the tendency. We will give you money to do research on migration as long as you concentrate on this and that topic. That's what the money is earmarked, if you could say so, for those topics. Is it about mobility? Mobility is also becoming very, very interesting because many times, because of these images and because of these narratives that I was referring to, you will always think about poor people coming from different parts of the developing world coming to the... but in fact, most of those who make it, with the exception of some that we will see, illegal refugees or illegal migrants, that they use the most extreme ways, most that dominate in this official movement, it's people that they are not cannot represent the poorest of their own societies. This is a very, very, very clear tendency, and these are some of the data that suggest to us that it is, in fact, middle-income countries that dominate when it comes to this mobility, and not the least developed country. Why is this important? Because sometimes it creates really contradictions with, for example, the issue of remittances. When you say that all those who leave their home countries, they are supporting very poor family. And that's a very relative thing. Because you will see middle class moving, supporting families that they are not in the extreme need. There are exceptions, of course, for this. You will see in some parts of Western and Eastern Africa that the social structures, they do help in this sense. That the extended family and its existence is still helping with this, and you will see people profiting from migrants and so on and so forth. In other discourses, at other levels, what we will see discussed in migration, it is this power relation. As I mentioned at the very beginning, it is south-north, it's poor-rich, it's rural-urban, and so on, and so forth, developed, less developed. And again, there is nothing further from truth than that, because when we think about migration, it becomes almost always difficult to stamp those who leave rich countries to come to poor countries because of a variety of reasons, most of them economic reasons, to stamp them or discuss them or study them as migrant. It would be really bizarre to study the European business community in India as migrants. They would not really qualify as migrant. They would not fit. There would be a noise in the system for us if you would classify them in that way. And that is something that it can be interesting for us to reflect upon. What is? Is it that abstract thing that is mobility or movement of human beings, or is it something else? Another thing that is also related to scale is the study of migrant at the lowest unit you could think of, the body. These are individual human beings that they are coming, they have their dreams and so on. So there is a whole deal of study that is dealing now with migrant in that sense, and leads to all these political declarations of we're talking about human beings as if we need to do that. It becomes really extreme for me when I see these kind of discourses, that at the end of the day, what they're trying to convince me of is that, you know what, the refugee that you're seeing coming from Africa or from the Middle East or from South Asia or whatever, is just a human being like you, has the same dreams and all that. I really don't need no kind of social research to convince me or suggest that to me. So we see the issue of gender, age, social status, and all that. Lots of studies that they have a value per se, but they become really dangerous when they become at the center of the research agenda, because I think they draw resources that will make us lose sight of. And of course, any sensible researcher or scholar that had been dealing with social science, he would answer very easy to all these stupid questions that I formulated here. Yes, it's about all the above. All that is needed. But I just want you to pay attention to the way migration studies moved in the West, for example. Just start by Ravenstein with his clear ideas about, we're talking here about economic resources and how people move, and how go again to Lee or all the other researchers, how they start narrowing down to specific of these specific scales, and how at the end of the day they lead us to a fragmentation of the field that sometimes can be useful, sometimes can be really detrimental for the whole research agenda. When it comes to power relation, as I mentioned before, you will see that some aspects, some roots of migration are much, much more important than others. This, for example, is one of the most studied. This is one of the ones that will be dominating in the international mass media. Just like the way the movement from Central America towards the United States in the last decade or so had been dominating, this one will be. And that tells you a little bit about it. Very few studies will be concerned about all this movement that is occurring and its burden on Mali, for example. Not even the Malians themselves have the chance or the possibility to reflect upon what does it mean to have all these people moving, creating all these kind of security problems and so on and so forth. So this is also something that is very, very important. I saw a proposal by De Haas and others in Oxford that it is really a good example of how we ignore the effects of this movement and focus on specific geographic areas. And this can be easily understood when you're told by the different European politicians, we're going to put offices in the northern part of Morocco or in the northern part of Libya, and we'll control things there so people not need to die in the Mediterranean Sea and so on and so forth. It tells you a little bit the issue of scale. This is the border. This is the most important thing for us. I don't want to be unfair to those, including some of the right-wing parties in Europe that say, no, we have to help these people in their own villages and all that. The Sverigedemokraterna, for example, there will be one. We want to help people, but we want to do it there. They should stay there. So all these discourses, as far as I'm concerned, they reveal to me the way we perceive all this phenomenon of migration. So here, these are very, very lousy speculations and all that, take them. But this is just a way for me to think about in which way can we use those abstract tools that are really, really important for understanding movement in general, to be able to say something about this specific field of study and this specific phenomenon. So I guess with these very general and very chaotic thoughts, I could stop there and have provoked some ideas and some thoughts. And okay, thank you. Should we take questions now or no?
We can get some questions.
Thank you. Very intimidating. Everything that has been done today is very intimidating, as far as I'm concerned.
So, does this work? Okay.
So, thank you, Yahia, very much for your presentation. My name is Martin Lemberg Petersen. I'm an assistant professor.
I know who you are.
Okay, thank you. I hope. No, I really liked your expansion of gaze, because I think it's very necessary. Both what Mina and you say is we tend to be rather myopic in the way we look at migration these days, especially in the global north. So there is certainly something to be said for even going back to archaic times. So just a few questions, because I've been studying up on my archaic human mobility as well. And I'm not sure, maybe I'll question you and challenge you a little bit when you say it's not so politicized. Because the impression I get when I read the works of Svante Pääbo and many others is that, in a way, you're right. They have objectivist ambitions, but in another way, seeping through their language are the language of colonialism and imperialism. So, talking, and I really agree with your time here. If we look at the very first map you showed, can we really talk about migration when we consider that it's happening over millions of years? In actuality, per year, people may not have moved almost at all. Yet when we speed up the time scale, then it comes across as migration. Or talking about humans colonized Australia. What's colonization in that use of the word, right? Is there a core periphery? Probably not at all. So in that sense, just to say, I think that actually the language is not neutral, but what it means is another question. Then finally, I suppose it's linked to the use of cartography. And it links with your point on the sort of the neoliberal use of category as well. The last map of Frontex you showed is very illustrative. The spaces depicted are only relevant insofar as people are en route to Europe. And it also conflicts with an earlier map you showed, which is the intra-African migration. It's vanished, right?
Yes.
It's only useful if people are crossing en route to us. And that creates a certain identity of migration, of migrants.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think that's perhaps the most crucial point.
Yes.
Because you used the concept of economic migrant too. How can we displace the identities associated with refugeehood, economic migration, if we follow your good advice and expand our gaze? How do we not get trapped in discourses of resilience and development and worthy and unworthy victims?
Thank you very much. I totally agree with you on the issue of politicization when it comes to even making narratives of something that happened 250,000 years ago. Absolutely, I do agree with you. But the way if I could use these words, attack that kind of narratives is by saying that they're using anachronistic concepts. They're talking about Mali or Chad or whatever when it did not exist. These spaces were born only 70, 80, 90 years ago. And I think that was what I was trying to do with the example of the Pangea when this part of Africa and South America were still one piece. It's just one of those language tricks that are unavoidable. Of course, I do agree with you that the more we talk about this, the more we create the risk of getting stuck in language. Definitely, I didn't mention the issue of identities and all that, but here, if I would have to choose something that will give me the chance to sit and talk to you about migration, it wouldn't be the whole deal of things that I've been reading about it, but my identity as a migrant. I was born in Western Sahara, and at the age of 11 years, I had to leave as a refugee, and ever since I've been in so many different places. And I have literally several identities. My name have several names. If you come to different parts of the world and ask and say Yahia, nobody would say know who I am. And I've been really struggling with this idea. What is it that makes that identity? And I'm very, very convinced, because of the way I was taught and all that identity has something to do with me. My way of thinking, my way of values, what I accept, what I do not accept. But the more I think about it, the more I realize it's not me who decide my identity. And I think here we can find works of anthropologists like Hyland Eriksen and others very, very interesting, because it's not you who decide who you are. It is the environment and the context that you come into. So I would struggle. I wish I could answer or say or propose something useful at this stage, but I would definitely think about the issue of scale and the organization of space, and look, and in this you can combine that scale of at the lowest level, the body, and the scale of the nation state, or whatever you want to call it, to be able to see what is the meaning for this migrant from Côte d'Ivoire that had to go through 4 or 5 countries, and in those different countries be called so many different things. I myself, I've been called in some places white, in others black, and it had been creating lots of confusion for me. Indian, you name it. I guess we will have to sit down and think a little bit about the issue of scale and its relevance. Is it relevant or it's not relevant? Or is it better just to accept the way migration studies developed and its language and say, we're studying different problems. Some of us are interested in the phenomenological experience of the migrant. Others are interested in the meaning for the national economy. Others are interested in the, I don't know, the system of transportation that it's being used. Some people are putting lots of effort just to give us a budget. How much does it cost to leave Nigeria and to come to Europe? Lots of studies there that are published to the left and to the right, just focusing on that part. And as a refugee, as a migrant and all that, I just don't see the meaning with that so rational part and all that, as if they're going to sell us something, as if there are those migrants that they will read in these papers to see, should I leave Nigeria and will it cost me this and that and so on and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. One more question.
Hi, Yahia. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. As you know, I'm really interested in these questions of scale and power, and particularly around the question of the production of scale, which I relate very much to what you said about power. Is it you know, about power relations and so forth? What I missed a little bit of is sort of deconstructing that we or they or our use of the concepts, because I think analytically they're so tied to space, time and scale in the sense of thinking who's using it and why are they using it and what are the implications for power. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on that.
Absolutely, that it's definitely not the migrants that they think in these terms, neither of migration and its all consequences, nor the scale. I know that you've been writing about the concept of jumping scales. And I just want to give you an idea of the way it had been used in the discourse on migration. If you go back and look on what happened in the central and northern part of Sweden, of Europe, including Sweden, in the last second half of the last century, you will see that migrants were people coming from Finland and people coming from Germany and people coming from Greek and people coming from Greece and people coming from different and Spanish, and you will see a whole developed language comparing how Spanish is and how Italian is and what kind of job should you give an Italian and so on and so forth. But step after step, something very interesting will happen with the European Union and so on and so forth. And it's that thing of jumping scales. One day you will hear there is a we, the Europeans, that in that we it's included a person from Norrland, in the northern part of Sweden, and somebody from Andalusia in the southern part of Spain. Those are the we that are so different from the African and the Middle East. And they think in so many different, they are very totally different. They do not have, they're not used to these institutions that we have here, of the family, of the private property and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing is that there are no guarantee in stability of that scale. Because all of a sudden there is a war and we're back again. Oh, the economic crisis, it should happen in Spain because they're so stupid and they've been buying this in that way. And that somebody from Sweden with the Protestantic background will never do something like that. We'll never consume over what we are producing and so on and so forth. So those jumping scales, they tell you a little bit about that sensitivity that I was pointing at to ideology. Because ideology is very contextual. What was unacceptable in this country, for example, in Sweden, only 25 years ago, it's a common part of this language discourse. Party after party in Sweden is telling us that, but we have to recognize that there is a problem of this thing with migration and how many migrants can we take in and so on and so forth. Believe it or not, just 25 years ago, if you would say something like that, you would be put in the extreme categories you could imagine. So of course, thinking about who is the we and who is they and all that, but again, it's a very complicated matter that is beyond what we could just think about right now. Thank you very much.